Ask Dan Schneider. This Ask Dan Schneider is one that's based on many questions that I've gotten over the years. And the questions I get are generally in the line of, what do you think about people who are frauds? Well, the answer is not that much. And I'm doing this Ask Dan Schneider because recently I found out that a noted fraud that I knew years ago when I lived in the Twin Cities recently died just a week or two ago. His name was Otis Powell. He was this black performance poet and artist, so-called. He was one of these people who had absolutely no talent and yet was ensconced in the grant giving schemes and shit of the Minnesota area. And it's interesting to note how when he died, he had numbers of local Minnesota newspapers talking about how he was a legend and he was this and that and he did all this to help and he was a community activist and all this. None of that is basically true. The reality is when people talk about these people who have no real talent, all they can talk about is the non-artistic things that they do. He was a community activist. How? In the years that I knew him, he was not involved in any community activity. He had a job on a local radio station. He was not influential. No one wrote like him because his stuff was garbage. His stuff was generic. When we talk about spoken word stuff, there is no real style. It's all the same. But I want to talk about the real person behind that because I've done this before when I did pieces on William Matthews and Maggie Estep and Judith Kitchen. These are people that had varying degrees of poetic skill, but most of the time their stuff was ignored. Maggie Estep, for example, her sexuality, her lesbianism, and her drug use was ignored, even though she died at the age of 50. William Matthews was a pervert. He did drugs copiously. That was all ignored in his stuff. And Judith Kitchen was a nice woman who just didn't really have much in the way of writing talent. But yet she was declaimed as somehow having some import, even though no one more than maybe 1,000 people in academia in this country would know who the hell she was. Now, the biggest sin that J. Otis Powell had was that he was a doggerless. He was a terrible writer. He had no writing talent. If you can find Googling some of his written stuff, you'll see it's nothing but cliche after cliche. If you listen to some of his stuff online that he performed, it's totally generic. There's no there. But aside from having no talent, there were a few other things that he was bad at, both on his public persona, stuff that he broadcast, and also in stuff that he performed. He was a rabid anti-Semite. I remember years ago when I worked for Hennepin County in Minnesota, I had to argue against his being given a spot during the National Black History Month readings. Hennepin County wanted to invite him, and I said, you do realize that if you listen to his show, he spews a lot of stuff that's not only just anti-Israel, which is fine if Israel does wrong things, but he was very anti-Semitic and against Jewish people. He was one of these people in his delusions that tried to blame American slavery on Jews and all that kind of thing. And I heard him many a time in person, especially at rants when he was in an altered state of mind, which I'll get to in a moment, railing against Jews as basically the devils incarnate. This gets to his drug use, his copious drug use. You will find also listed in the things about his person that he died of a liver ailment and was in an assisted living facility or something. Well, he did heroin. I know this because he bragged about it. And he did cocaine, and I know this because I saw it. He would do lines of cocaine, often while performing or before performing. And this is well known. I'll give you an example. In 1998, at the local Ball's Cabaret run by Leslie Ball, J. Otis Powell was banned from performing at Ball's. He was banned from Ball's entirely by Leslie Ball. Leslie Ball is a recovering alcoholic, and she didn't want to feed addiction, so she banned people who were drinking or doing drugs from performing. One night, J. Otis Powell came in about an hour early, and he demanded that he be allowed to perform on stage. And Leslie said no, because he was clearly high. I had just gotten there, and Powell then went after Leslie Ball. People who know Leslie Ball know she's a nice woman and a woman. J. Otis Powell was a man, and he started manhandling her, and I basically had to pull him off of her, roll him to the ground, put him in an armbar, and then instead of Leslie Ball calling the cops, which I suggested, she just wanted me to throw him out. So literally, I physically had to get him up, drag him out, and throw him out the door of the Southern Theater so that he wouldn't attack Leslie Ball. Leslie Ball, however, was not the only woman that J. Otis Powell attacked and abused. Now one could say, well, he was a drug addict, he was a user, he was a this, he was an addict. That still doesn't excuse his behavior towards her. So here we have it. This is a guy who was a bad writer, a bad person, an anti-Semite, a misogynist, and a drug abuser. And yet he is being listed as if he had some influence, even though he didn't have any influence. Now, compare this again to James Emanuel, a great American poet, a black man just like him, who lived 30 years longer, who actually wrote stuff and had some influence. And this is why we have the problem in modern American society, because crap is promoted. And these people who talk about him as if he was a saint and if he was influential and had real talent, maybe he was, in private to them, a good person. But just like with Judith Kitchen, who was a good person as far as I know, who never did drugs, never attacked people physically, and never railed bigotedly against people, that doesn't matter. So when we deal with phonies like a J. Otis Powell or the many other people out there from the David Foster Wallaces on down, you have to look at the real truth, and this is what I can do. And we live in a society where I couldn't say this if he was still alive, even though I would have proof with someone like Leslie Ball, who was attacked by the man, because we live in a society where reality doesn't matter. Truth doesn't matter, only what people want to say about each other, and most people just want to fillet other people because they figure someone can help them get published or get in the arts. That has to stop, but it's not going to stop anytime soon. But now that J. Otis Powell is dead, I can say thankfully, thank God he is.